I'm happy to introduce Frank Fehrenbach, our next speaker today, speaking about Warburg and Grisaille, from the University of Hamburg, where he is leader of the research group Images of Nature, the Alexander von Humboldt research group at the University of Hamburg.
If you find it, is it on? Let me start with two apologies. First of all, as you will see, my talk is not very tightly related to Aby Warburg, I'm afraid. And even more so since I try to follow the time frame religiously. And that means that I cut off a huge chunk of Warburgiana in order to show more beautiful images, being one of those least reasonable of academic beings, an art historian. And the second apology concerns the inclusion of a few untranslated passages by Warburg, but I'll try to do my best and summarize them as far as I understand them. Du lebst und tust mir nichts. You live and do nothing to me. So goes the formula Warburg put forth in his unpublished foundational fragments toward a pragmatic theory of expression, a monistic psychology of art, grundlegende Bruchstücke zu einer pragmatischen Ausdruckskunde. Horst Bredekamp and recently Spiros Papapetros have brilliantly analyzed the motto. I am interested in its significance within an ancient tradition for which liveliness functions as the highest aesthetic aim. For Warburg, images as life immobilized hold the viewer's reaction in suspension. They mark a pause, time out, that interrupts the flow of actions of the tactile human, the Greifmensch, producing that state of balance that Warburg longed for even as he was aware of its instability. It is only the immobilization of the living object that makes possible the virtual enlivenment of the immobilized, allowing for and requiring at the same time the viewer's freedom, as for instance with ornament. Cornelia Zumbusch has convincingly worked out this, as she called it, quote, double movement of animation and deadening. The joy of the innocuously moving body, as I quote Warburg, which the image makes possible and which stands in contrast to the original phobic reflex, suggests the systematic meaning of life in Warburg's analysis. With the pathos formula, Warburg establishes an element of movement and life in the image that is not arbitrary, but rather corresponds to primordial anthropological experiences. And I'm not telling anything new for many of you. Not every artifact and representation thus possesses life. The category retains its analytical and descriptive value, in contrast to the fetish, for instance, which can be arbitrarily determined. Yet images are also always crossing over into lifelessness. They keep the borders between living and unliving, so to speak, transparent, a border which in cultural history and the history of science have never really been closed. And this is just an illustration for Warburg's ongoing interest in the expressively moving body, Willy von Beckerath's paintings in the Hochschule für Kunst und Gestaltung in Berlin. And with this, as again many of you know, Warburg limits or determines life very much in the context of the fin de siècle and of Art Nouveau, and within the idea that life consists basically in movement or self-movement, expressive movement, rather than in the more traditional triad of self-movement, perception, and metabolism or composition. For Warburg's analogy between art and apparent life, his reflections on Graumalerei, Grisaille, are of paradigmatic importance. Charlotte Scholl-Glass has brilliantly shown the significance of Warburg's statements on the subject, emphasizing especially the effect of alienation or dissociation. Warburg ascribes a de-escalating therapeutic effect to apparently plastic, apparently three-dimensional Grisaille paintings. We could call it a dimming of energia. In his essay on Francesco Sassetti, he describes the Grisailles of Santa Trinita as energetische Ausgleichssymbole, ohne dass ihnen, die schattenhaft unter dem Heiligen verweilen müssen, zugleich schon das Privilegium zugestanden wäre, durch die gebärdensprachliche Eloquenz ihrer römischen Virtus direkt stilumbildend in Ghirlandaios ruhigen Realismus einzugreifen. The keywords here are energetic and shadowy, so Grisaille as something that would reduce the dynamics of the antique paradigms. Even more strikingly, in the Sassetti chapel, the, as Warburg put it, uncannily alive ghosts, the images expressed by Grisaille paintings, are, as it were, and I continue with Warburg, exorcised by their integration into the firmly established Christian medieval thought system, Gedankenarchitektur, end quote. Grisaille painting reappears in Warburg's late notes of 1929, where it is again characterized as a genre that enables dissociation or artistic sophrosyny. Again, a quotation, die scheinplastische antike Grisaille oder Stich- bzw. Holzschnitt hält den Schattenzug der vorgeprägten, präfigurierten Revenants in metaphorischer Distanz. Again, key concept here, terms are the shadowy procession of revenants kept at a metaphorical distance, turned into metaphors. With good reason, scholars have been more preoccupied, and I think this conference is also a good example of this, preoccupation with Warburg's phobic concept of the image, according to which images both temper and actualize primordial fear responses to transgressive movements. Their aim is a dissociative objectification. Philipp Eckhardt has recently pointed out a corresponding theory of perception in the German Aesthetics of Empathy, especially the work of Robert Fischer. Monika Wagner has furthermore recently noted the importance of colorless black and white photography for Warburg's ideas about the power of images and its containment. Probably one reason why Warburg didn't focus on the spectacularly colorful fake marble slabs behind Mantegna's otherwise paradigmatic Grisaille reliefs. Yet, as Charlotte Scholl-Glass has recognized, one of Warburg's late notes departs from any exclusive interpretation of Grisaille as a means of alleviating fear, to paraphrase Predikant Diers. The note reads, Bilderatlas, Grisaille equals arkadischer Seelenraumbekenner, primitiv einfältiges, primitiv tatkräftiges Menschentum im Wunschraum. She could perhaps translate as Atlas of Images, Grisaille, Arcadian confessor of space, of the soul, primitively simple, naive, primitively energetic humanity in the space of desire. For Scholl-Glass, this extremely complex remark is not mainly about dissociation. Rather, it characterizes Grisaille painting as a, as she put it, space-generating medium, or even something like an inner utopia, end quote. In Photo, Kino und Computer, Karl Sirek emphasizes the pathos formula's dialectic between the tempering and strengthening of psychic energies. In a 2011 edition of the journal Bildwelten des Wissens on the theme of grayscales, Graustufen, the editors note the, quote, maximum of optical refinement bound up with representation in gray. Grisaille painting in this perspective would not simply decrease the effective power of colored images, but rather would work to intensify the sensibility of the beholder. Therefore, perhaps the most useful term for understanding the concept of Grisaille that comes across in Warburg's late note, this one, is found, in my view, in Georges Didier Ubermont's lucid remarks of 2003 in Vertigo number 23 with reference to Merleau-Ponty, latency, or, to put it in a more neatly Aristotelian way, potentia. The question for the historian might go something like this: is there actually such a thing as monochrome Grisaille painting? This is a question I posed in 2011 in a brief essay I wrote for a special issue of the journal Source, in which I claimed that grisailles, indeed from their origins in Giotto, are often furnished with colored accents and nuances, producing the emergence of color in the uncolored. I interpreted this in the broader context of the differentiation that took place in the early modern period between painting and sculpture, more precisely the emancipation of painting from sculpture, beyond the commonplace, though, of the meta-representational. At a conference in Bern last month, on the theme of chiaroscuro, the historical panorama of the so-called Grisaille painting was refined on many levels. Monochrome drawings on colored, sometimes flesh-toned paper, very fascinating genre. The extremely subtle coloristic nuances seen in 15th century monochrome Franco-Flemish miniatures. The significance for Grisaille of the emergent print technology, already recognized by Warburg, as we've seen. The reduction of color in the surface of an ontological difference or chronotopological distance, the achromatic as past or future, we've just seen an example an hour before or so, or as a means of intensifying the effect of directly adjacent colored paintings. Today I would like to approach the theme from yet another angle, which might help us to render Warburg's late note perhaps more clearly. Specifically, in what follows, I'm concerned with apparent monochrome sculpture. First, however, let us take a step back and ask about the relationship between color and enlightenment very quickly. The analogy between color and life has a long prehistory and in the early modern period became a popular motive in creation narratives. Vasari, in his Proemi, tells us that God shaped the first humans from earth because he wanted to demonstrate his mastery in the most imperfect material, before then imbuing his raw creation with, quote, the most lively color of flesh, color vivacissimo di carne. Or, as Anton Francesco Doni summarizes the story in his Aretino, Adam was made and then incarnate with colors. Fu fatto Adamo e incarnato con colori. Enlightenment is also the decisive criterion in the boundaries that arose between sculpture and painting along lines of color. Oil techniques, first experimentally developed in the North for polychroming sculptures, especially for flesh tones, were gradually withdrawn from statues and reserved for the production of living bodies in painting. As Anne-Sophie Lehmann puts it beautifully, and I quote, "It was as if oil painting was pried from sculpture in order to awaken life in panel painting," end quote. Around 1490, Leonardo da Vinci categorically excluded color from sculpture, arguing that sculpture did not have as much intellectual complexity as painting, required meno discorso, because it did not possess any color, del colore nulla. Soon after this, Pomponius Gauricus, in his 1504 treatise on sculpture, carefully goes over symmetry, proportion, physiognomy, and the various sculptural materials, but does not even mention polychromy. Nearly 50 years later, Giorgio Vasari, in his elaborate introductions to the various arts, says nothing about polychrome marble or metal sculpture. Instead, he mentions only colored wood sculpture as a way to override the deficit of a material that is incapable of representing the main achievement of the third manner, vivacità, through softness. Morbidezza, wood sculpture is by definition a hard and crude and dead material that needs still color in this perspective. In this situation, it is impressive to see how sculptors took on the challenge and managed to turn the tables. In other words, sculptors of the Italian Renaissance accepted the limiting verdict of the painters and transformed the handicap into a triumph, revealing themselves in the process as the true masters of living stones. This goes far beyond the reference for antiquity, whose polychrome sculptures had lost their colors over time. But if you look at this, are they therefore without any color? This is the Apoxyomenus after Lysippus in Basel. Is this monochrome? Nor do other motivations for working in monochrome or without polychromy, such as easing suspicions of idolatry, the greater durability of unpolychromed surface, or the criterion of material truth, as opposed to the deceptive make-up of color, really capture what was at stake here. Does monochrome waive the right to evoke living bodies? The monochrome marble reliefs described by Dante in Purgatory, here Botticelli's famous drawings of the subject, these monochrome marble reliefs were executed by no one else than God himself, who demonstrated his unsurpassed mastery to represent the living alive, as Dante put it, and the dead completely dead, quote, in brilliant white marble, end quote. An old topos of praise in the discourse on love offers a basis for sculptural border crossings, namely the metonymies between alabaster, ivory, marble, and skin. Here I will paraphrase Martial's epigram 6 on the statue of Julia, quote, "Who did not believe that you, Julia, had been shaped by the chisel of Phidias, or that you were born from the art of Pallas Athena herself? The white Lydian marble seems to answer in the speaking portrait, and a living splendor shines on your serene face," end quote. Martial begins by saying Julia is as beautiful as a marble statue and ends by simply addressing a statue as Julia. The discourse on love draws close connections between the purity and inaccessibility of women and of stone. Indeed, it was skin tones that were first left uncolored on otherwise polychrome or two-toned ivory, alabaster, and marble statues, because a mimetic equation between white skin and those white materials had long since been established. I'll show you here Andrea della Robbia's adoration in the Victoria and Albert Museum. More important than such mimetic correspondences, however, is stone's coloristic ambiguity, which finds its counterpart in the role of chromatic transitions in processes of animation and de-animation. For this notion, Ovid's Metamorphoses offers a wealth of material. Before Pygmalion's monochromatic ivory awakens to life, the love-sick sculptor adorns it with makeup and colored fabrics and lays it on a purple blanket. After the divine intervention of Venus, the statue is enlivened by becoming flesh, but its ensoulment is staged as the coloring of its surfaces, during which a transition takes place from tactus to visus. Pygmalion's tentative hand first experiences the warmth, then the softening of the ivory, and finally the beating of the pulse. As the nameless statue attains consciousness under his kisses, her eyes begin to perceive, and her face blushes. Virgo sensit et erubuit. Why are stones colored? Theophrastus gives a clear answer in his extremely influential treatise De Lapidibus. Colors arise through the solidification of originally moist and soft stone, a solidification that is brought into effect by heat. Elena di Venosa has shown how such ideas were passed down from Pliny and Albertus Magnus to, for instance, Camillo Leonardi of Pesaro, who was a doctor for the Borgia in 1502, authored the Speculum Lapidum. Stones that in this tradition that have been acted upon by heat or calor, or then can absorb an especially high amount of it, are white. This again underscores the unique position of marble. in the human body too, the life-sustaining substances of breast milk and of the semen experience a dealbatio, a whitening through innate heat. Marble and bodies thus partake in the same life principle, heat, whose effect can be observed in the whiteness of their substances. Consequently, Avicenna believed that the human embryo at the beginning was as white as milk, and the physiology of the living body expresses itself then later on as alteration of this color, and that's the important argument. Quite consequently, sculptors played with chromatic transitions and subtle deviations from monochrome. One could put these under the rubric of impurities and try to work out their narrative potential. Already in antiquity, for instance, the famous macula, the spot on the side of the Cnidian Venus of Praxiteles, offered grounds for interpreting the stain as a form of organic remnant, and thus as an example of the erotic power of art. In this rhetorical perspective, stains and impurities can reference something that happened to the statue and that demands narrative resolution. An example of the potential of those impurities, veins, stains, and discolorations to initiate narratives is seen in Giovanni da Nola's monochromatic Saint Jerome in Capodimonte, where the vertical veins on the chest of the ascetic saint allow the sculptor to indicate bodily fluids like sweat or blood. Such concrete or thematic associations are much more common than one would expect. Their paradigms are the ancient statues of the flayed Marsyas made of colored marble. The veins in such works not only connect stones and bodies in a lexical sense, vene, they also go back to a straightforward analogy that found poetic expression in Ovid's story of the deluge. The sole survivors, Deucalion and Pyrrha, throw stones behind their backs that turn into living human beings. But, you see it here, quote Ovid, but what had been the veins in the stone survived under the same name, end quote, in the living body. Leon Battista Alberti would explain this in natural philosophical terms with reference to Theophrastus and Albertus Magnus. The veins in marble are reminders of its origin as liquid. The parallels between the vene di marmo and the blood vessels of living bodies thus went far beyond mere metaphorical transfers. The veins of stone can thus display the blood vessels of the living body. They make visible that which runs beneath the surface. Antonio Lombardo's powerfully veined bust in Vienna, 1515, paraphrases the older son of the Laocoon group, but now cleverly reverses the paradigm of the sculpture awakened to life. The bust shows an agonized, dying body, it's the culmination of his signs of life, in whom it is not blood that flows, but already the black poison of the giant snakes, as Virgil puts it. Monochromatic sculpture claims, as it were, to transform itself into living flesh, sometimes ostentatiously, more often subtly and on the borders of perception. More ostentatiously in Matteo Civitali's Man of Sorrows in the Bargello, where the skin of the tortured Christ appears as if drawn upon by bruises. By contrast, in Mino da Fiesole's bust of Giovanni de' Medici, same museum, the impurities of stone could stand for a 5 o'clock shadow. And in his portrait of Deity Salvi Neroni in the Louvre, the weathered surface of the stone identify the seasoned enemy of the Medici, including a long vein that alludes to a permanent tear on the exiled man's cheek. Moreover, for careful viewers, both the natural modulations in the stone's color and the differentiated treatment of finishing of the surface can already create something like an optical illusion. And with this, I'm not talking about the more obvious effects, ambient effects that are a theme for poets like Giambattista Marino, candles of torches, changes in daylight, ambient colors, and so on that would alter or make ambivalent the surface of the monochrome sculpture. Here too, with these very subtle modulations, painters would have led the way. One thinks, for example, of the delicate coloristic nuances of Giotto's Padua grisailles, the first large-scale monochrome reliefs. They endow the fictive sculptures with an emergent colorfulness, a desiderium, so to speak, to become a living body. And I'm referring, of course, above all to the left hand, but you can also find it on other parts of the body and on many other of these grisailles. Following Giotto's example, many painters created refined transitions within a single image, which suppresses color even while allowing it to appear. Here, just as an example, Holbein's Grey Passion of circa 1500 as a nice example in Stuttgart. It is this ambiguity, this hovering, that gets lost in any straightforward reference to ascetic practices, Lent practices, and the negation of color. In his 13th century Narratio de Mirabilibus Orbis Romae, Magister Gregorius tells of a fascinating yet unsettling experience. And I find this quotation absolutely outstanding. Enchanted by the apparent liveliness of 13th century, by the apparent liveliness of a marble statue of Venus, possibly the Capitoline Venus, as Leonard Barkan proposes, Gregorius recounts, quote, "This statue, made with such wonderful artistry from Parian marble, appears to me more like a living creature than a statue. In her nakedness, she seems to blush, as if a reddish clay colored her face. And those who behold her up close are wont to say that blood flows beneath her snow-white flesh. Because of this wondrous statue, and probably also because of a hidden magical force, I had to turn back to it 3 times, even though my inn was 600 yards away." End quote. In Magister Gregorius's report, we encounter some of the oldest formulas in the ekphrasis of statues. Yet even topoi can shape reception, modeling expectations of which artists themselves are aware. Amanda Lilly has noted, for example, the extremely subtle attention to flaws in Donatello's reliefs, which is the example from the Victorian Albert. But Donatello went even further than this. His Pazzi Madonna in Berlin appears in the incredibly fine gradations of its gray-pink surface to evoke the colors of skin, a delicate glowing and fading, so convincing it is hard to believe your own eyes. More explicit still is the play upon the latent colors of the stone we find in Amadeus' portrait tondi in the facade of the Certosa in Pavia. The stone of the fictive ancient personages seem here to want to become flesh. Just a few years later, Pomponio Gaurico, 1504, would recommend subtly varied alloys to allow the redness of living skin shine through, as he put it, in the surface of bronze. And I show you here Pompeo Leoni's Philip II in Madrid in armor. And if you look at the treatment of the skin, you see what Pomponio Gaurico must have had in mind, this tanned skin color, right, that appears to be animated flesh. In conclusion, the subtle handling of the surfaces proves that already quite early sculptors were foregoing colored treatment. Antonio Rossellino's bust of Francesco Sassetti. Of course, we don't really know how or to what effect patinas and varnishes came to be used on untreated surfaces. Gian Lorenzo Bernini notes that even time itself effects a change in the surface of the marble, which after 9 or 10 years, as he puts it, begins to resemble the skin of a body. Already the careful handling of surfaces with pumice or polish produces striking tonal differentiations of the sculptural epidermis. Here again, Antonio Rossellino in New York in the Metropolitan. Quattrocento sculptors must have already noticed that heavily polished skin surfaces possessed a much deeper shade then the rougher areas of hair and drapery finished with a file. And when subtle colors emerge in colorless material, still other miracles could be expected in the sculptural body. In his ekphrasis on Lysippus' statue of Ocasio, Callistratus writes, quote, "And although she was of bronze, she blushed. And although she was by nature hard, she melted away softly. And although she possessed no living perception, she gave reason to believe that feeling resided in her." He's talking about a statue. "She was actually motionless with both feet firmly on the ground, but though she stood still, it was quite obvious that she had the power to move quickly," end quote. Differently than with Pygmalion's ivory statue, here, reddening or blushing stands at the beginning of the spectacular sequence of the signs of life, from the softness of the flesh to sensibility to the capacity to move. With this, we have hit upon that dimension, I think, of enlightenment, which is connected not with the phobic triad of heightened presence, violence, and fear, but with desire. Is there not a blind spot in Warburg's theory of images? I return again to Warburg's late note, Bilderatlas. Grisaille, Arcadian confessor of the space of the soul, primitively simple, primitively energetic humanity in the space of desire. Here, Warburg is indeed referring to a primordial, simple desire, Wunschraum, that emerges in the monochrome. Across from the dissociation and deadening of transgressive enlightenment, violence, and passion, stands an equally primordial, primitively naive desire of animation, a liveliness that, however, remains latent in the renouncement to stronger coloration. Grisaille paintings and monochrome sculptures, I would argue, are paradigms for complex play between renouncement and intensification that establishes that the sometimes uncanny, sometimes erotic, sometimes uncannily erotic character of artistic forms, held at the brink of life, emergent color, stone and metal in transition toward living flesh, in the process to become alive. Thank you very much.